I'm VEDA Reed. I was born in Granite, Oklahoma, January the 5th, 1934. Where we live is the area known as Tornado Alley through the midwestern part of the country. So I grew up in a lot of storms. And it was just fascinating country. It's very flat. It's plains country, except for the small mountains that we have that are quartz mountains. They're part of the Wichita Range that comes up from Texas. In fact, they are the end of that range. And they're very short. The tallest one is about 1,500 feet. We would climb the mountain for fun, and we would climb the water tower, which was located on the mountain, because we weren't supposed to. And we would go to a particular area on the mountain called, the Bullseye, and have cigarettes, which we weren't supposed to be smoking. Oh, and it was just a great time. It was a very small community. It's a farming community, and Granite, the town of Granite itself, the only industry was mining the mountain. The quarry was there, and everybody made tombstones. I mean, that was the business. And the other commercial adventure, if you can call it that, was the state reformatory was there. There are, and were at that time, about the same number of people as there are now, about 1,600. And that includes the inmates at the reformatory. I think it's interesting, at least for me, is I went to school from kindergarten through the 12th grade with the same people. I mean, we knew each other all of our lives, and I've talked to other people who find that very strange, but you know, that's the way it was. And my only exposure to art was an aunt who is about, I guess, 12 years older than I am. And my mother came from a family of 7 children, and their mother died when this aunt, Joyce, was only 6 years old. And so the older siblings raised the younger ones, and Joyce was with us a great deal of the time. And she was interested in art. I don't know where she learned to paint, but she used to copy pictures out of movie magazines, and I just thought she was terrific. We didn't have art in high school or grade school or any part of school when I was growing up. When I graduated from high school, I was 17, and Joyce, my aunt, had married and was living in Salt Lake City. She had become an artist. She had lived in San Francisco before marrying. And she was a fashion illustrator. And she also taught at a little school called the Art Barn in Salt Lake City. So I stayed with her and her husband for a year after graduation. And she enrolled me in art classes. And so that was my first adventure into actually studying art. I was in a life drawing class, I remember. And I also remember that the female artist wore a bathing suit, and the male artist was nude. That was my first encounter with nude models. It was sort of shocking for a little girl from the southern plains of Oklahoma. Oh, but it was a lot of fun. And after that year, my father was a pipeliner, and I don't know if you know what that is. This was in the early 50s. It's when gas companies were laying gas pipelines across the United States and indeed across the world, and that's what my father did. And of course, he traveled a lot doing that. And when my year with my Aunt Joyce was over, my father was in Memphis working on a pipeline, and I came to stay with him. And I didn't have anything to do. It was summertime, and it was very, very hot. This was in 1952. And we had a Studebaker. I remember the car very well, because that was the only thing I was allowed to do, was to drive the car. I didn't know anybody. So I would take the car and drive around town. And one day I drove down Adams Avenue and saw this Victorian building. I'd never seen buildings like that before. And there was a sign over the door that said, the Memphis Academy of Arts. I stopped the car, I got out, I went in, and I came out a registered student. It was fabulous. It just seemed like this was where I should be, and indeed it was. I have to back up about when I first went through the door, because this was in the corner building. There were two buildings that the school occupied. And walking into the corner building, the one with the sign over the door, there was a desk and a woman sitting behind it. She was the registrar. Her name was Olivia Tompkins, and she had white hair and very bright red lipstick. And she greeted me like I was a long-lost relative, and asked me if I was interested in art. And I said, well, what is this place? And she said, this is an art school. Are you interested in becoming a student? And I said, well, I don't know. What do I have to do? And she said, well, you have to fill out this registration form. I mean, there were no admissions requirements or anything. And I said, well, okay. And so I did. And she asked me what I was interested in, and I told her at the time commercial art, because that's what Joyce did, my aunt, my favorite aunt. And she said, well, that was fine. She'd made out an appropriate schedule. And she said, had I had any other art courses? And I said, well, I recounted the life drawing class that I had had in Utah. And she said, oh, advanced classes in drawing. She was writing all the time. She said, we can sign you up for a night class in life drawing. And I said, well, okay. Oh, so she did. She did all that, and I agreed to all that. And then I said, how much is this going to cost? And she said, $175 a semester. And I said, I don't have any money. She said, that's okay. Just tell your father, and he can write us a check when you come for the first day of classes. I said, thank you very much. And that's what I did. But I was grounded for a week. I couldn't drive anymore. My father was too embarrassed to say no. I mean, he wouldn't dare not pay after I had agreed. Oh, so that's how I began. There were only 3 people in my graduating class 4 years later, so I suppose full-time students, maybe 36 or 37, you know, it was very small. And it was just like a big family. With Ted Rust was there. He had been there a couple of years, I guess, by that time. And we used to have parties out in the backyard, you know, grill hamburgers in front of the carriage house. And it was just marvelous, marvelous fun. Everybody knew each other, and all the students, didn't matter what, you know, what courses you were taking, everybody knew and helped and studied together and played together. And we used to, as students, sneak in the buildings. Of course, we weren't supposed to, I guess, and work all night long. The buildings were 3 stories, and they had, I suppose they were fire escapes, ladders on the outside, stairways, metal, and we would leave a window open on the 3rd floor and go up the fire escape and get in and do our work. And I'm sure everybody knew we were doing it. But it was just fun. Just everybody learning together. And I soon realized that commercial art was not what I wanted to do. I took my first painting class, and that was it. I knew that's what I needed to do. I took watercolor classes, but I didn't like it because it was too immediate. All that drawing was too quick, and you couldn't make the kind of changes that usually I ended up wanting to make. Gosh, this will really date me. Acrylics were only sort of beginning at that time, so that was not an option. You know, just. But I knew that was what I wanted to do. Peter Baruzzi was my first instructor, and I really don't know what made me love it so much. It seemed that there was so much freedom in the way you could show things, you know, the way you could approach things. And whereas in commercial art, I was still thinking along the lines of being a fashion illustrator. I mean, that it was just sort of too cut and dried, and not as much opportunity to express oneself, you know, as I learned that I wanted to do. Ted Fairs was one of my teachers, painting teachers, and he taught me more about design than, well, I won't say more, but different ways to approach design in painting. Because I had a very good design teacher. There was a required course in design. Martha Turner taught that. But Ted showed me how to sort of manipulate the flat surface in ways that I never would have, you know, thought of. Of course, that's what teachers are for. And he was, all the teachers were so kind and gentle and everything. Then I had Calvin Harlan, who, Calvin had spent a lot of time in England and knew a lot of the English landscape painters of the time, the contemporary ones. And I was into landscape painting at that time, as I have been all my life, I guess, now. And so I learned a different kind of appreciation for paint handling and surface and all of that from him. And then, of course, Dorothy Sturm was my major teacher. And from Dorothy, I learned how to think, how to reason, and how to make things work. And it didn't matter what the subject was, it still had to work. So, you know, all together, they were just wonderful. And I can't leave out Burton, although he never taught painting at the Art Academy. He taught drawing. And from Burton, who has been my mentor forever, I learned that you have to be truthful. You have to get it right. You can't cheat. Burton was the first teacher I saw when I began at the Art Academy. It was in basic drawing, and he had some cylinders and cubes and things on a table. They were all painted white so that, you know, didn't get confused by color, and they were lit with a lamp. And he emphasized visualizing a center axis so that you could get, you know, things symmetrical that were symmetrical, and this was to be done in line only. And I remember doing that just as long as I could until I was very bored, and I thought, I'll do some shading and I'll impress this teacher how advanced I am. And so I proceeded to put shading on my cubes and cylinders, and Burton would go around to each student, and we had these drawing horses, benches, and he would sit down, and he is so gentle and had such a sweet, soft voice. And he would sit there, and he would sometimes take up a pencil and make corrections or show you where it needed to be corrected. And he came over to me and he sat down and he said, "Oh, I see you're interested in light and shadow." And I said, "Yes, yes." He said, "That's really good." But he said, "If you just put shading on a poorly drawn form, all you have is a bad drawing with shading." And he said that in the kindest way you can imagine. And I just said, okay, I get the message. So, best lesson I ever learned in my life. Burton only taught the basic classes, the basic drawing and perspective drawing. We had a class in perspective drawing then. And he, before I came, Burton had taught some sculpture classes, and he taught art history, some art history. But while I was there, all he taught was drawing, and it's just that the school was so small, you didn't have to be in a teacher's class to know them or to learn from them. And he and Ted Fairs and Dorothy Sturm and Martha Turner were just available. Well, all the teachers were available to all the students at any time. At the end of the year, there was a first-year art show, and a reviewer for the Old Press Scimitar, Guy Northrop, reviewed the show and commented on my painting, and there was a picture of it. And of course I was thrilled beyond words. I graduated in 1956, and that was in June, and I was sort of at sea for for the summer months, and the registrar at school had quit, and Ted Russ called me and said, "Do you want to be the registrar?" I said, "Sure." I didn't have a place to live. I had lived, I rented a little shotgun house down on the river underneath the old bridge. Well, the new bridge wasn't even there then. And it didn't have hot water, I remember. And Dorothy began to feel sorry for me, so she offered to rent me space in her house over on Jones Street behind St. Mary's Cathedral. It was a wonderful house. And so I rented a room and the attic space from her and painted up in the attic. Dorothy was a matriarch in every sense of the word. She had a group of friends, followers, who came to the house often, and we would all sit around and drink and smoke and talk philosophically. And she would make spaghetti, and usually we would all have some sort of task to do. I mean, something that she needed done, we would do. But those were wonderful times too. You know, I'd never been involved in anything like that before. There were architects, Charlie Ginn and Francis Ma, and they were all young, and they were all part of this entourage of Dorothy's. She just had this following. And because I lived there, I was sort of involved in all of that. And that was fascinating to me. And she had a coffee table that Charlie Ginn made for her. And I remember that we'd all get together and she would give us linseed oil, which as we sat there and talked, we would rub this table with linseed oil. So Dorothy decided that she would send some slides of mine to Bertha Schaefer, which she did. And Bertha Schaefer was very complimentary and said she liked the paintings, but you know, they don't fit her gallery or whatever. So she gave the slides to a young dealer named Morris Weisenthal, who owned a gallery called the Morris Gallery in the Village. And he liked my work, and he offered me a show. And that was in 1957. This was a year after I graduated. And the first show was really quite successful. I had a review in the New York Times and a couple of reviews in Art News. And I subsequently had 4 shows there. But it was becoming increasingly difficult to show in New York and live in Memphis, and I did not want to live in New York. I'm just a country girl, I guess. I was the registrar at school for 4 years, and in 1960, I had saved $1,000, and I bought a ticket on a freighter out of New Orleans and went to Liverpool. That's where it went. And then made my way from Liverpool to Cornwall, where Calvin's friends lived. He had sent a letter of introduction with me, and I stayed with them for, I guess, 2 or 3 days while they helped me find a place. And I found, they knew a woman in a little village called Mousehole, although the English pronounced it Mousel. And Her name was Betty John, and she had a room for rent. She was the divorced wife of Augustus John's son, Augustus John being the portrait painter, the English portrait painter. And she had quite a reputation for being a jolly person. So I rented this little room from her, and the house was called the Old Fish Store. So my address was the Old Fish Store, Mousehole, Cornwall, England. I got to know a lot of people and had a wonderful time. Went to Italy with some friends that I had met in England for a couple of weeks, and to France. And then when I used up my $1,000, I got on a boat and came back. I saw so much art, especially in Italy. All the cathedral paintings, and all the Giottos and the Della Francescas and all those. I was spellbound. I just was spellbound, and I was so enamored of this work that I guess I reached a point where I felt like what I was doing was not significant enough, and so I needed to really discover what it was that was significant to me. Eventually, I learned that it was the landscape. But I was really in a quandary, when I came back from that trip, because I had just seen so much and experienced so much that I was not sure of myself anymore. So I came back to Memphis, did not have a job, and again, Ted Rust rescued me. He said they were considering hiring someone for public relations. Did I think I could do it? And I said yes, and I had absolutely no idea what public relations even was. Well, I lasted about 6 months. Both Ted and I realized that I could not do this job. So he offered me a teaching job, and I haven't left yet. The place is literally my home. My life has been shaped by the Memphis College of Art. I taught all the basic courses at one time or another, like two-dimensional design, basic drawing, lettering, perspective drawing. The most important thing I wanted to impart to my students was the thing that Burton Callicut taught me. You got to get it right. You can't cheat. I didn't consider it cheating. He didn't either, but it's like skipping several steps to get to an end result. The result's not going to hold up if the foundation is not there. So that's the thing I wanted more than anything. In my later years, I taught, well, I conducted, you don't teach critique. I conducted critique classes in advanced painting and drawing, and those were wonderful. I mean, just, students bring their work in and everybody gets to say what they want to say, and students have to defend or not, and it's really exciting. When you get a student who really begins to understand what you're talking about, it's just watching the light go on and how exciting it can be. It's truly a wonderful experience. And also, I learned so much from being a teacher. I mean, you can't avoid that part. There's got to be a give and take. the challenges for me were convincing myself that I knew more than the students, you know, that I was really able and capable and qualified to do this. And I did. I convinced myself. Oh, but I loved teaching. I dearly loved teaching. My peers as students and the teachers were all just sort of one. We were all working together for a common goal, and that was to learn, to learn, to learn. So I didn't find any difference when I became a teacher alongside my teachers. And I didn't perceive that they found anything different about it either. I think they were all pretty proud of me. At least I was proud to be with them. We worked 5 days a week, summers and sometimes nights, you know, to make a full teaching load. It's not like when the school got bigger, there were more teachers for one thing. You went home and you painted. I mean, that's just what we did. Well, actually, I came back and I began doing large flower paintings, which very few people know about. But I did that for 2 or 3 years. And then I realized that that wasn't what I wanted to do. And I began going, you know, when you're 17 years old and you grow up in a little community like I did, all you want to do is get away. And I began to realize that all I wanted to do was go back. I returned to the landscape and began searching for a way that would make it my own and that would convey what I really wanted to say about the landscape. It was not just, I didn't want to just paint a house or a, you know, whatever, but I wanted to say something about being in awe of nature. The thing that I love about the western United States, especially where I come from, and New Mexico and Arizona, is you can see a long way. There are, you know, in western Oklahoma, southwestern Oklahoma, which is the plains part of Oklahoma, there are very, very few trees. And the ones that exist have mostly been planted as windbreaks. So they're not very close together, so you don't feel hemmed in at all, and you can literally see forever. And that's what I love, because the sky is just full of dramatic events, which I love. Another thing that people don't realize, I suppose, is that when you are in a highly elevated place like New Mexico, where you're 8,000 feet and surrounded by mountains, or actually on the mountain or whatever, the cloud formations are entirely different because the wind is affected by the mountains. And so that's entirely different cloud formations sometimes than, say, when I'm in Oklahoma and at 0 yeah, altitude, because the wind then can come all the way down, you know, and it sort of swoops in, and when you're higher up, it has to manipulate. It has to go around or do something. There are certain types of clouds that are primarily only formed around mountains. So, you know, there's that. There's lots of different things to look for and be excited about. My favorites are the mammatus, the ones that look like hanging balloons filled with water because they're so unusual. I mean, the shape is so so different. It's amazing once, you know, once I have identified what these clouds are, I see them more frequently. I suppose that's true of anything you know about, then you're going to recognize it. But they form on the underneath side of an anvil cloud, which are the clouds that produce tornadoes. And the mammatus form usually when the severe weather is over. So, you know, you may be walking around under this bank of these hanging clouds. Mammatus means breasts, and they do, you know, they look like just sort of sagging breasts. And they can be any color depending on where the sun is. So I have seen them gray, I have seen them pure white, I have seen them golden. So it's really spectacular. I have moved from being very specific to, well, I hesitate to call what I do abstract because it's not, but it's more of a, well, just the essence of what the experience was more than the snapshot of it, more than the picture of it. Because it all, you know, it all, I have a cousin who loves to send me pictures of sky things. And she sent me a bunch of pictures on the internet not too long ago and said, oh, I thought of you when I saw these. I just thought maybe you'd want to paint them. And they were, you know, some fantastic images, but I had to write back and tell her that I don't paint anything I haven't seen, because it's just not the same thing. I need the experience of seeing it and being there and experiencing it. There's this one place in Granite where I grew up, out in the middle of a field, a cotton field, where I go to paint the sunset, and the next morning I go to the exact same spot and turn in the opposite direction and paint the sunrise. Just, you know, it's amazing. I love it. It's usually the sketch outside, plus photographs. I do both while I'm out there. It's important to be outside and sketch because that's part of the experience. I mean, the wind blows incessantly in Oklahoma, and that's all part of the experience. And it doesn't blow in New Mexico, you know, it's different. But anyway, it's being out there and actually making the observation and translating what you see. And then I take a lot of photographs, you know, just to back up my memory. If there's a particular color or something that I'm not real sure about, and things like that. Then I come back to the studio, and I spend a lot of time determining the shape and size of the canvas. Well, I don't mean that I spend a lot of time, but it's very important to me for the proportions of the canvas to be right for the image for some reason, because there are certain dimensions and proportions that are jarring, that are not comfortable, and that's very important for it to be right for the image. It's only recently that I've been doing vertical paintings, because I found a way that I can make these right, make it work. I usually start with a charcoal drawing, very light, just to sort of mark off places that colors need to change or things need to happen. And then I begin by putting on a very thin layer of paint and then just building up in layers and layers. Recently, I have discovered a new approach, especially in the red paintings in the last show, if you saw that. I started out by putting just a base coat of red over the entire canvas, and it turned out to do exactly what I wanted it to do. I wasn't sure that it would, but it did. So that's something new that I've begun considering. This painting behind me began coated entirely in yellow, so it has a yellow surface that I started with. One of the reasons is because I'm, if it were drawing, I'd say erasing. I'm taking away layers of paint as I add new ones, so that the yellow continues to show through. It's working for these new images, so I'm pleased with it. But then it's a very slow process. I use a medium and thin the paint very, very thin, and just build up and layer upon layer until I get the quality of color that I want. I needed to find a way that would convey my feelings about nature. And so finally I have developed a way. And actually it's still evolving, although it's gone about as far as I can go with it right now. But I guess that's the biggest and most important change I've been through. It's the realizations that you come to, the understanding and the knowledge. Those are the big things. Work every day. Don't forget good craft. No matter what you do, it's got to hold up. Just study and learn and look and listen, and always be open-minded. I usually come out here in the studio and sit every day and look, but sometimes there's not anything I can do to the painting. I used to try to keep two going at once so that when one was drying I could work on the other one, but I've sort of stopped doing that too. One of the hardest things for me right now is I'm getting arthritis in my hands. That is very hard. But I have a brother, a dear brother, who has decided, I convinced him that he should if he would, make my stretchers for me. So he's started to do that. So I don't have to do that. I don't have to build. Although I can still do it, it just takes me longer because my hands don't work as long at a time as they used to. But there's nothing hard about it. It's just wonderful. I did the painting, the memorial for the 9/11 disaster. And Ted Rust and Burton Callicut and I used to meet for lunch over at the Sleaze and Slime Cafe and at school. And we were meeting for lunch one day after that show opened. And Burton came in, and he had just come from the show. And he said, "Veda, that is the most beautiful painting you have ever done." I guess that's my very proudest moment.